So hello, everyone. Thank you very much and welcome for joining this Endeavor event on impact investing. I'm Philippe Dongier. I did my MBA at INSEAD in 1993, and I'm part of the Alumni Endeavor leadership team.
And my name is Gen Shiraishi. I am part of the 21J class, currently doing my MBA at INSEAD, representing the Endeavor MBA Club as VP of Career.
So Gen and I, we are co-hosting this event. So it's co-hosted by the MBA Endeavor and by the Alumni Endeavor groups. So we want to hear from you during this webinar. So for that, we suggest you use the Q&A box at the bottom to post your questions. And if you want to comment, you can also use chat, but we're going to take the questions from the Q&A. So you can use either, but please put your questions in the Q&A. Now, your audio is muted because there's quite a few of us, and your camera is turned off for the duration of the webinar. But as I said, please use the Q&As below. So we're really delighted to welcome our three speakers, and they really each bring a very unique perspective to the topic. So let me introduce them. First, Professor Jasjit Singh. He's a professor of strategy at INSEAD. He actually teaches really great courses on impact investing. And Jasjit will start us off. He will frame the discussion today by defining impact investing for us and offering some views on a range of key questions, including whether or not one should acknowledge a trade-off between making money and having impact. So Jasjit, thank you very much for being with us. I want to introduce Sir Graham Wrigley. Really very pleased to have you with us. Thank you. He is the chairman of the board of the CDC Group, which is the UK's development bank and a world leader in impact investing. And I think that's true both for CDC Group and for Graham. So he'll give us a practitioner's view, having founded himself what became a leading and very successful private equity firm with more than $20 billion under management. And then very interestingly, at one point, he shifted his career to focus on impact in the least developed countries of the world. So he'll react to some of the points that Jasjit will make and give us his insights as well. And our third speaker is Emilie Abrams. Emilie is an MBA student right now at INSEAD, and she's the president of the Student Impact Investing Club. But interestingly, she's also a co-founder of several other social initiatives, such as the INSEAD Sustainable Food Club and AgTech Mexico, which is an organization that does technology transfer to Mexico farmers. And Emilie will also react to the same points that will have been framed by Jasjit. And then in the second part of the webinar, we'll discuss careers, how to think about careers and impact, and we'll have perspective from our three speakers. And Emilie will also share information about the Impact Investing Club and how we can get involved. So we're gonna start with Jasjit. And Jasjit, please help us frame the topic. Specifically, the questions we've discussed is how do you think about debates around a potential trade-off between financial return and social value? Also, the whole issue of credibility of the field. Is there a risk that impact investing loses credibility given all the hype around it right now? And also given the challenge of measurement. So over to you, Jasjit.
Thank you so much, Philippe and the organizers. It's a pleasure to get a chance to share my thoughts. I wonder if the slides are being shared. I'm not sure. I don't see them, but great. So I'll take about 7 minutes, 7 slides. The starting slide is an observation that historically, the space of impact and the space of investing used to be two different conversations, with impact primarily being about philanthropy, aid, and so on. But we've been obviously in the past couple of decades seeing a convergence, and that's where the field of impact investing also comes in. Importantly, it's important to bear in mind that impact investing is not the only kind of investing that's happening at the overlap of that. There's another group of people coming more from a philanthropy lens or philanthropy first lens, which you could call venture philanthropy, where there's an active approach of seeking impact through an investing lens rather than a giving lens. And then from the other side, of course, we hear conversations about sustainable, responsible investing, ESG, and all of that, where investing while taking care of societal issues is seen as an important investing lens in itself, risk mitigation, opportunities on customers, employees, next generation, and all of that. And impact investing is this thing that sits right in the middle, and which is why I think a lot of the conversation gets confusing, because people are sometimes thinking of this from a more impact lens, some are thinking from investing lens, and where is the right balance? So it's in this context that I want to first get a sense from the audience in terms of, let's go to the next slide and launch a poll, just to give a sense. Let's see how people feel on this question. And so we are launching a Zoom poll here that I would like you to participate on, which is, if you got to decide what kind of investments can be classified as impact investments, which would you allow? Would you restrict it only to those investments where there's a willingness to compromise on financial returns for impact? Would you be willing to only restrict to those where there isn't a compromise and they're also delivering or at least promising to deliver market returns? Or would you be open to the idea that, yes, it causes confusion to allow both, but we are still going to allow both of those to use those terms? So let's give maybe another few seconds. Yeah, so we see some answers coming in. So it's interesting, about 70% of the people are willing to allow both categories, and only 9% in the first category. And so I think we can close the results. But what is notable here is, I think if you do this poll in different audiences, the expectations are different. So for example, very often when I do it with a more socially minded group, they would sometimes argue for the opposite. And that's exactly, I think, where the confusion arises. But in terms of definition, if we go to the next slide, what is impact investment? So the generally accepted definition, of course, is that we should allow both. So there is indeed an expectation of returns, but where the disagreement is there is, well, is there some compromise because you're seeking impact, or there isn't a compromise, or if anything, maybe there's even a premium, but the expectation that at least your principal is preserved would remain just definitionally there. But what is critical is there's an intentionality for impact, but more than that, there is an explicit strategy and management, often accompanied by measurement, in terms of, are we really delivering the impact that we are seeking, right? So going on to the next slide and putting it a little bit in the context of a broader spectrum of investments, we see these two categories of impact investing, the non-concessionary and the concessionary. But on the right of the non-concessionary one, there's a blurry line with what is more broadly and a much bigger bucket of sustainable responsible investing, right? So that space is about 30 trillion assets under management by some estimates, while impact investing is just about 700 billion, right? So impact investing actually is generating a disproportionate amount of excitement, but the reality is, in terms of the slice of the pie in the investment world, it's still pretty small. That's something to recognize. And then, of course, on the left of the concessionary, if you go further down, and you're even willing to lose some of the principal in the process of investing. For example, Gates Foundation does this very often, saying, it's all right if you lose 50% of the principal. Our goal here is to invest in potentially high impact, early stage ventures, training them to sort of go beyond grants and start thinking like a business. And the hope is that they'll be able to transition into impact investing and then ultimately to mainstream investing. Very importantly, in the spectrum, we should not interpret this as there is more impact on the left than on the right. This is a question of the differences in intentionality and the extent to which you're relying on market forces for an impact. It doesn't necessarily go hand in hand with saying, hey, charities always have more impact. Well, that's not true. The important thing is it's different kinds of impact, and different places on the spectrum are tools appropriate for different kinds of problems, different kinds of populations. Next slide, please. But one of the interesting things that's happening, and this I've been thinking about a lot this year, something I had not thought enough about in the previous year, is I recently ran one of my courses for the alumni. I run this course called Strategy and Investing for Impact in the MBA, EMBA program. So I also started running a version of that with alumni, and two of the participants in that program, Jerome and Rodrigo, were among the co-founders of a VC firm called Expon, and saying, well, we actually wouldn't invest in anything where we don't see a strong sense of impact. At the same time, we see impact as a huge opportunity. And but we don't want to label ourselves impact investing, because very often that restricts the kind of people that would work with us, the kind of investors we would attract. Because there is still a general perception that if you are an impact investor, somehow you'll become sloppy on the business side, which I thought was an interesting point of view. So going to the next slide, if I see the world, here's one way to see the world of impact, which is on the y-axis, I asked the question, are you pursuing impact seriously? On the x-axis, I'm asking the question, are you using the impact label? And so the choice is not just about traditional investing versus impact investing. We also have increasingly a category which, in some sense are playing the game within the sustainable investing bucket, which is a much bigger bucket, but still have a strong emphasis not just on reducing negative impact, which is what a lot of times the ESG metrics do, but actually generating positive impact towards solving important problems, for example, what the Sustainable Development Goals would cover. And then the last bucket that we really want to avoid, but that still remains a current issue, is this impact washing, which is until there is real credible approach towards making sure we are going to have the impact, there is always a risk that there would be some investment firms which will not necessarily have all the rigorous processes to ensure impact, but they are aggressively marketing impact. And I think I see that as a challenge that continues. So just going to my last slide then, and this is a comment from Impact Invest, from Oxfam report from 2017. One of the issues is very often the debates in impact investing end up being, are we getting market returns or not? And Oxfam's point, which I completely agree with, is that we should start asking the second equally important question equally frequently, which is, are we having real impact or not, right? Very often, people just take it for granted that, hey, if you're serving the base of the pyramid, somehow you'll magically have impact. But that's not true. If you look at the history of microfinance, and if you look at the studies that have been done through rigorous randomized controlled trials, it turns out microfinance in general, especially mainstream microfinance where interest rates can be ridiculously high, like 100%, and so on. And one single person can sometimes have 5, 6, 7 loans and end up in trouble rather than becoming magically an entrepreneur. I think the issue is we need to get more nuanced on thinking about, are we really delivering the impact we are seeking? Or are we just telling nice stories around impact and just focusing too much just on financial returns, taking the impact for granted? So I'll stop here and we can continue the conversation later. So thank you.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, Jasjit. That really frames it very, very well. Let me turn to Graham. Graham, you've had a career, an impressive career in private equity, as mentioned earlier. And then now you've spent 15 years working with a focus on low-income countries. So curious to know from you, as a very experienced and successful practitioner, what do you make of Jasjit's comments? And then the question really that I have in mind is, look, if business in Africa and in Asia, can be profitable, many would argue there is no need for development finance and impact investing. What's wrong with markets working, basically? Over to you.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me on the panel. Like I thought Jasjit set a great framework for thinking about these things. And I think particularly his point about trade-offs is not discussed enough. And ironically, it echoes another professor I work with, in this case, a Brazilian Marxist. After I left Premier, I studied at SOAS. And he took me to the side one day. He said, Graham, he asked me, what are you doing here in this class? I was 43, and I told him, and he said, well, you do know, Graham, that the win-win is the false hope of the neoliberal ideology. Now, 15 years on, I do fundamentally believe in the power of markets to be a force for good, like at INSEAD. And if you go onto Gapminder, I've obviously worked in development, and you look and see what's happened to Bangladesh and China and many other poor countries. It is remarkable development progress in the last 50 years, and without markets working, that wouldn't have been possible, I really believe. But for some parts of the market, for some development challenges, and some of these crucial and significant, I do believe the market doesn't work, and it won't work unless there's an explicit recognition that returns need to be traded off to achieve the SDGs. Now I can give you, a few points and data examples from Africa, my own experience, but also actually CDC's experience, which is long. The CDC was set up in 1948, really is the first development finance institution, DFI, and really the first impact investor. Our second chairman said CDC's mission is doing good without losing money. So just a couple of thoughts. Firstly, if you look at the overall situation in Africa and the need, it is just huge. Just one example, Ethiopia, a country with 112 million people, double the size of the UK. In the UK, we have 15,000 companies with a turnover of greater than $50 million. In Ethiopia, we did a study a few years ago, and there was 17. Just huge. Now, there are many reasons for that, but one of them is capital flows. And despite, all the talk of billions to trillions, since 2015, FDI to Africa has fallen 20% until 2019, and it'll be down another 25% plus, post-COVID. And we see that across the board, banks, multinationals, private equity. There are many reasons for that, but the one that's cited the most frequently that I've heard is just frankly the returns are not enough to justify the perceived risk of investing in Africa. If you look at the private equity market in the continent, the data bears that out. It's given low single-digit returns. And if you're a Californian pension fund, why are you going to invest in Africa, when you're going to get 4% rather than in Western Europe and get 15%? If you look at one sector within Africa, I'll talk about power. 600 million people in Africa don't have the luxury to turn on a light switch. Now, if you do look at the installed, to answer your question, Philippe, if you look at the installed capacity of power production in Africa, I don't think you'll find hardly any projects where DFI money has not been crucial to getting those funded. CDC, our money has funded 90% of the installed power in Cameroon, with others, of course, and over 30% of the installed power production in Uganda, Kenya, Cote d'Ivoire. Now, infrastructure and power is at the easier end of what we do. We've achieved 7-8% returns, and we've developed, a separate investment policy where we explicitly recognize, as long as our goals are ambitious and we're valiant and hard-nosed in our approach, where we recognize that losing money is not a necessary sign of failure, called catalyst. But those 7 or 8% returns, do they work for mainstream investors? We had a big sovereign wealth fund into the board last week, and their cost of capital for investing in infrastructure in Africa, 20%. So to answer your question, I think that win-wins, we really, is what is needed, where you can get risk-adjusted return at scale. And Ronnie Cohen talks about this. To get $2.5 trillion a year to achieve the SDGs, you need risk-adjusted return capital to come in. And I do believe that Africa will be the new frontier at some point. It will happen. I started when I started in Primera. you know, Italy, Western Europe was regarded by Americans as the Wild West. And in Africa, there are some great investors, Runa Alam, DPI, Meridian. But at some point, there will not be the need for DFI capital. But right now, risk-adjusted returns are not there. And I think that there is a danger, as Jasjit said, by over-promising returns, risk turning absolute success, achieving something of high impact with capital rather than grant money, into relative failure because you fail to meet promised returns. I think SDG 17 partnership is actually the most crucial one of all, with the public and private sector to working together. But I think without recognizing and being honest about the reality of returns and accepting trade-offs so that capital can play across the full spectrum, in particularly in the really hard places, like, you know, what we do in power, solar home systems, you know, a microhydro project in Virunga in the war-torn part of Congo, we're not going to achieve the SDGs.
Thank you very much, Graham. Very interesting. Yes, so the win-wins are there for many things, but then there are some other pressing needs where you need to mix the investment, the private investment with some more caritative funding. Understood. Very interesting. We'll turn to Emilie. Emilie, you're not the typical MBA student. You have a first-hand grassroots experience with entrepreneurs and investors in Mexican agriculture. You've been part of launching, you know, several impact initiatives, including one that transfers technology to low-income farmers in Mexico. And you're currently doing your MBA at INSEAD. So we're very curious to hear your reaction to the points just made by Graham and by Jasjit.
Thank you very much, Philippe. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
okay,
perfect.
Great. There's a bit of background noise, so hopefully it won't be too disturbing. So my focus is really on sustainable food and agriculture. And I was working with smallholder farmers, connecting them to consumers and top restaurants in Mexico City. And then later I started managing a portfolio as part of a entrepreneurial accelerator in Mexico City, and noticed that a lot of the projects that I was working with were trying to address the same challenges, from storing produce to reusing farm waste. It really struck me that they were trying to solve complementary problems which required cooperation, but they weren't speaking to each other. And so I started organizing very informal happy hours, which grew into a type of knowledge sharing platform and networking platform, connecting different actors from the entrepreneurs, farmers, corporates, government, and investors, and getting people together to build an entrepreneurial ecosystem. And while doing that, I noticed a mismatch between the investors who were looking to deploy capital in Mexican agriculture and the needs of the farmers and entrepreneurs themselves. The investors were targeting much larger ticket sizes and looking to drive sophisticated high-tech solutions such as blockchain traceability, IoT sensors and soil, which we were seeing much more in other parts of Latin America, such as Brazil and Chile. But Mexico is a very different ecosystem, and much more basic supply chain solutions, like ensuring that vegetables that were harvested in one part of Mexico were consistently refrigerated during transportation to a supermarket in another part of Mexico. And improving existing systems just by increasing access to markets and efficiency would have much more impact before these more sophisticated technologies were implemented. And these more basic kind of incremental additions would require different kinds of capital, a more patient capital, and much smaller seed stage level investments. So my big learning from all of this was that one size does not fit all for impact investments, even in the same sector or region, and that it's imperative to understand the needs on the ground.
Great. Well, thank you, Emilie, and that illustrates very well the point that that Graham was just making, that some things are win-win and some are not. So excellent. So let's pass now the floor to my co-moderator, to Gen, who's going to lead a discussion now on careers and how we can think about getting involved in impact.
Great. Well, thank you, Philippe. Thank you, panelists, for a great discussion so far on impact and some of the trade-offs that we need to be thinking about. But at the end of the day, us alumni, us students, we also want to talk careers. A lot of us are so interested in pursuing, an impact career. And we're at a point where we're trying to figure out what does that look like, and more importantly, how do we make it happen? And so we'd like to talk about a little bit from the career perspective, and specifically some advice that you may have for current MBA students as well as alumni. So Graham, I'd actually like to start with you, if that's okay with you. You've had a fantastic career, starting actually in management consulting and then in private equity, and then making this big transition to your impact career. What advice do you have to INSEAD MBAs and alumni on how they should navigate their own impact career?
Well, those are kind words. I mean, the first thing I'd say, I've been very fortunate, Warren Buffett's, lottery of life. I was particularly fortunate to come to INSEAD, where I was doubly fortunate to meet my wife, Mia. But it's great to be asked that question. When I set up and taught the LBO class in the late 2000s, all the students wanted to talk to me is, how do you get into private equity? Can I get a job at Primera? So I've thought about this question a bit over time, and I kind of have 3 points: context, pace, and motivation. The first of all, kind of context. I do feel uncomfortable when people kind of talk about impact investing as some kind of higher calling. My dad was a research scientist, my mom was a teacher. That's real impact. I think you can work for an NGO, you can work for a lawyer, you can be, run a factory, be an entrepreneur and hire people. These all have, massive societal benefits. I also feel like every human being is unique. And so in a talk like this, I'm very nervous about pontificating and generalizing to anybody. But, the second point about sequencing is about sequencing and pace. And here I am thinking narrowly about impact investing. And I thought I'd illustrate my view about there's different ways to do this by talking about 2 people, in the industry I really admire. There's you can see there's a photo of them here. The first is Michelle Gibbons. Michelle left university. She tried to get into BCG. She failed. They didn't think she was aggressive enough. She was kind of just went off in a fit of pique and started working for an NGO in Palestine. When she was doing that, and then she felt I actually should get some business skills, so she did an MBA. And then after her MBA, she went into the IFC, working Eastern Europe, but then really wanted to be stuck in with, and this is like in the 90s, working for Shaw Bank in Bangladesh, and also back to the West Bank again in microfinance, and then came back and set up Bridges, which she is now the co-CEO and founder. So Michelle took kind of a tough and lonely road right from day one, thinking about what became known as impact investing, and is now, Bridges, a well-known brand. Michelle is on the global steering group, set up the impact management project. So that's what she's done. Ramesh Susu, interestingly, also had, parents of Palestinian refugees, but he was driven to succeed from day one in the financial world. He went to Harvard, Goldman Sachs, Soros, where I actually used to compete with him in my private equity days. And then he spun out and created Towerbrook, where he is co-CEO and co-founder. It's a blue chip, $12 billion private equity firm. But Ramez is different from many people. You know, he in the private equity. I remember in 2004 he approached me to set up the private equity foundation. If you look at their website, you'll see that, you know, he made Talbot the first B Corp, 100 black interns, ESG, Harvard case studies, level 20, but it's not greenwashing. So Ramez's decision was really about having leverage through Talbot and the wealth he could create and the impact he could have through that. My own path, and there's a picture of me there in 1981 in India before most people on this call will probably be born. And I went traveling in India and Nepal, and I always felt guilty I didn't volunteer. So I said I was going to do something else when I was older. But I wasn't as selfless as Michelle after Bain and INSEAD, and I wanted to get a house and build a family with Mia and have kids. But the thought was in the back of my mind, and I just became fortunate that I could, you know, start a new career. So I started talking about it with my fund management colleagues, and in 2005 I left, retrained. I was 43-year-old and started my new career. So my point in this is there are different routes. You know, you can start from day one, you can do it halfway through like me, or just carry on doing mainstream work and having an impact. And, you know, whether you are 25 or 65, and, you know, you can do things. My third point is motivation. I would think, you know, deeply about what motivates you. And, you know, like what's the subject matter? For me, it was development. For other people, it could be climate, it could be inner city poverty. But whenever I interview people, there's always a trigger somewhere. And I think people who've been successful have always had that passion. I think the other thing you need to think about motivation is what scale do you want to work on? You know, do you want to work on something big? Or do you want to work on something small and pure, like a high volume thing or a high gross margin thing? You know, for me, you know, CDC, it's a 72-year institution. I had nothing to do with its creation. I've been one part of the team. Since I've been there, we've increased investment from $300 million a year to about $2 billion a year, but I'm just one part of the team and just the chairman, you know, and there's a whole great team at CDC who do the real hard work. I've done work in Nepal where there's a small institution that I set up, working in livelihoods in remote areas, and that I know that it wouldn't have happened without me. But which one's the best? I don't know. But I think the questions you should ask yourself are, where do you think you can have the most leverage? What are your skills? What motivates you? Because I think if things don't motivate people, you won't be able to do them well, whatever it is.
Thank you so much. Super interesting to hear about your own experiences as well as the two kind of mentees that you've had in your life, and just the importance of defining what impact really means to us, and using that as a kind of our guiding compass in navigating our impact careers. I want to turn it over to Jasjit. You're, you know, a professor, an impact professor at INSEAD. You know, course offerings, and also what are some other activities, programs going on? Please tell us about your course. I'm very excited to join your course next period. It'd be great if you could provide a little bit of an overview of kind of from the academic perspective, how people can engage with impact related activities more at INSEAD.
Sure, thank you. Not surprisingly, we got, you know, a lot of wisdom from Graham there, and many of the things that I try to bring into the course is exactly what we are learning, engaging with people like Graham, who are really at the frontier of this field. And just to reiterate, perhaps in slightly different words, what Graham said, because these are themes that come up in the course. One is this issue of scale of impact versus depth of impact, right? And there's this obsession with, did I touch 1 million lives or did I touch 10 million lives and so on. And as Graham rightly pointed out, it's important to bear in mind on, well, touching lives is one thing, changing lives is another. And, you know, if you really contributed in the lives of, let's say, a community of even a few hundred people, in a way that you fundamentally transform their lives, and it would not have happened without you, that impact might be significantly larger by some counts, or certainly different from you reaching 1 million lives, but in a way that whatever problem you're solving is not the most central. If you weren't there, somebody else would have solved it and all of that, right? So we go back to this conversation very often where we talk about these 3 circles, where one of it is, of course, your passion is absolutely critical. If you're bored to death doing something, or if somebody's guilting you into doing something in the impact space that you couldn't care about, you're not going to last in there. So one is absolutely your personal passion, but then going back to, is this an important problem to start with? Is it important at least to somebody? and how do I sort of evaluate whether this is the right opportunity? And the third is, and these are, the same as what we do in strategy, right? We look at market size and we look at competitive advantage. And it's the same thing, which is this an important problem to start with? And does your being there really, to use the business school buzzword, add value to that? Or you're just there? If you're coming in, and this is why, I'm reluctant to say if you're an impact investor, sort of doing $50 million deals, that doesn't necessarily make you better. It doesn't make you worse either, just that in itself, than somebody who's doing $1 million deals, because you're probably coming at different stages of the venture, contributing in different ways. And the buzzword in the impact space is your additionality might be different. If you're the first investor that's going and discovering this gem that nobody was willing to take a bet on, and because you have this appetite for taking risk and this priority for impact, you're willing to bet on them. That's a very unique kind of impact. And that's very different from you showing up in Series E when somebody is already a well-established large tech venture. Yes, they are delivering market returns. But if you didn't, come in, maybe there are 20 other VC firms willing to come in. So the nature of the impact, even though your scale is bigger, but the nature of impact also changes. And I think it's important to bear in mind, both are important. Where are you well suited comes into the picture. I would say one of the things that we don't talk enough about is actually 2 things, is appetite for learning, which is you have to recognize that you won't get it right the first time. And just making money doesn't mean you made it right. Just hitting 100 million doesn't mean you made it right. Tom Shoes is a case that I use in the classroom, which the founder Blake Makowski himself has acknowledged that even though he's given away 100 million shoes to poor kids around the world, he acknowledges openly that, in hindsight, the impact was minimal. It's a great story. Everybody buys it. But this is the point about, it's not just about scale. It's about, how much did you transform lives? But the question of learning, and in his case also, he evolved the model, which is being responsive, not just to financial performance, but on how you're affecting people's lives or environmental issues, measuring and learning and constantly improving the model. That's important. And that can't be done if you don't have humility. And that is a skill, to be honest, business school professors, students, and business people, all of us really need to work on. We have this sense that we are smart people, so we can solve any problem through a PowerPoint presentation we'll prepare in 2 weeks. Yes, that has its role, but I think humility and openness and learning and respect for people doing other kind of work. So you might believe that you'll get market returns, which is fine, but have respect for others who are working on tougher problems in tougher communities and not delivering market returns. So I think that's what I keep on going back to.
Thank you so much, Jasjit. I want to turn it over to Emilie, who's leading the Student Impact Fund at INSEAD. And we'd love to hear a little bit more about what that initiative and how not only ongoing, students in the MBA program, but also how alumni may be able to get involved.
Yeah, thanks, Gen. I think I had a slide to share with us. Cool, thank you. So the Student Impact Fund was founded less than a year ago by 320Ds, who were a mix of INDEVOR and IPEC, the private equity club members. And they noticed that many other top business schools had their own impact investing fund, but INSEAD didn't, and decided that the fastest and best way to maximize student learning with this was to partner with Loyal VC, an INSEAD founded venture capital based in Toronto, Canada. And they partnered with them to have students working across 5 key impact investing activities, as you can see here, and with the support of 3 faculty members, Jasjit being one of them, in addition to Lucy Tepla and Vikas Agrawal. And we also have support of various alumni, notably Edgar Van Kipperslewis from 99D, I believe, who has attended every single one of our ICs. And since then, we've had 2 cohorts go through, each with about 25 team members, and we've just selected the new 21D team, which will be our 3rd ICIF cohort. And we've had quite a successful last several months with 7 companies selected through the IC, which we source from INSEAD alumni. We've raised 50K USD deployed by Loyal on our behalf. And we've had 6 follow-on investments recommended, including INSEAD, which won the INSEAD venture competition a couple of years back. So it's definitely been one of the more enriching opportunities for me and for my peers, I'd say, in terms of social impact at INSEAD.
Great, thank you so much, Emilie. So with that, I think we can wrap up the dedicated section to talking about some of the career, and we have about 15 minutes, a little bit shy of that, for Q&A. And so we've actually received a few questions from the members of the audience, and feel free to continue adding some questions there using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. But I'd like to kick us off by going back to kind of the heart of our discussion so far. You know, Graham, talking about how, you know, the dangers of saying that we must only pursue, you know, a win-win, and Jasjit talking about the trade-offs that we need to recognize. The question is, how do you see the field evolving in terms of coming to terms with that? What are the latest trends in terms of funds and other active entities in terms of their attitude towards recognizing or ignoring these trade-offs that we've been talking about so far?
Well, look, I think this thing comes from both sides, by the way. So it's about the private sector recognizing, you know, you have an obligation to society, and, you know, thinking more broadly than just the single bottom line. But it's also a recognition from government and foundations that there is a role for the private sector in this. And if I go back to when I was studying at SOAS, then there was a view that kind of you have the markets who are the bad guys from SOAS, and, you know, governments are the good guys. And I think you know what's happening is you're seeing much more interest in blended funds, which have potential but are also very complex. But you're having a framework about which, you know, the SDGs, you know, put on the table. You know, like here are the 17 goals, and now that's getting into a much. I mean, you know, all the points that Jasjit made are absolutely right about being more data driven, but it is very hard to actually quantify. But there's a huge amount of work going on to try and standardize, quantify impact so that the other side of the balance can be assessed. I mean, I could go on for hours, but I'm just on that topic. We'd do another whole hour, but so,
if I may build on directly Graham's point, and, you know, I don't want to be, I want to make sure that we are not conveying a picture that everything is a trade-off and there are no win-wins. I think the important thing is there are lots of win-wins. So that's not that's not what we are contesting. What we are saying is not everything is a win-win, and we need to have respect for people, which very often are nonprofits or social enterprises or organizations choosing to stay small, people working in policy, which are recognizing that, or people that are taking the first risks to make these blended finance instruments possible, because somebody has, in places where there's a lot of risk, to bring private sector in, somebody else has to move first, or provide loan guarantees or things like that, or even public organizations funding R&D. An Apple iPhone would not have existed if US government had not at some point provided money for basic R&D that ultimately evolved into technology that led into Apple iPhone. At the same time, there are amazing opportunities if you want to stay within more mainstream business. I've been fascinated by the case studies of Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods. In many ways, they are actually, they are not framed that way, but they are actually applying blue ocean frameworks to this space. They are saying, what would it take to sell plant-based diets to the meat eaters, not the vegetarians? Because just selling plant-based diets to the vegetarians is not going to fix the climate crisis. If we go to the meat eaters and we don't guilt them, we just say, hey guys, we can get you a product which is an excellent product that you can consume, and by the way, it will have an environmental benefit, but it's good for you because you enjoy it, the taste is as good, and perhaps the pricing is appropriate and all of that. Or think Tesla versus the earlier electric cars, right? Tesla's big innovation was that they came up with a car where here was an electric car that didn't have performance compromises, right? And so for building the next Impossible Foods or Tesla, you need cutting edge business people who are thinking big and delivering something at scale. And we absolutely need those. The other thing I want to emphasize is also this point about there's this obsession with positive impact, but as has come in some of the comments and questions, you are having an equally valid and important impact on the world if you're reducing negative impact, right? So if you are in Walmart, or if you're in a consulting firm, or you're in an investment bank and you're helping reduce inequalities or climate issues, and you're trying to make their business in a way that it becomes more inclusive. We had a guest speaker last week, Jesse Coates from EY, who's helped build an impact entrepreneurship practice, consulting practice within EY, so that a firm like EY is able to take its consulting business and provide it to social enterprises. I think that's incredible. So it's not like impact is only happening in rural Kenya or rural India or rural Cambodia. Yes, that is important, but so is a lot of the stuff you do. Or the example of bridges Graham mentioned, investing in a chain of low-cost gyms, which makes access to healthy living possible for low-income people in the UK. That's a different kind of impact, and that scaled, and that was a profitable exit if I remember. So yeah, there are lots of win-win opportunities as well. So it's a little bit of what, like Graham said, what's the right path for you? What's your calling?
Very interesting to recognize the diversity of kind of impact pursuing opportunities that are out there, and how it's these new collaborations that you can make with public entities, blended finance, to achieve some of these goals that haven't been achieved before. We're actually getting a lot of questions on that I think underpin a lot of what will enable better action in this space, which is better measurement of impact. And specifically in one of the questions we're seeing, what do you think of the IMM impact multiple of money approach that was recently tested talked about in the Harvard Business Review? But Jasjit or Graham or even Emilie, in terms of thinking about assessing deals and assessing the impact potential versus the financial metrics, what is the latest and greatest when it comes to measuring impact in a standardized way across all the different types of impact that exists?
Do you want me to start on that? Okay, so I mean, we at the moment at CDC are looking at our framework for the next 5-year strategy. So we worked out there's about 173 different impact measures across the world. So I don't think there was a gold standard. That's what we've come to the conclusion. It is a very hard thing to do. Even if you look at like development, if you look at FCDO, the UK aid budget, you know, how do you compare a grant to somebody in Yemen versus, you know, building up rule of law in Congo? You know, and those are grants. It is very hard to turn it into a, you know, I know people are trying with impact weighted management accounts, but turn it to $1, it's a hard thing. So the first thing is to avoid proliferation. And within the development financing community, you know, we're working with an announcement last week by IFC, the joint impact indicators, where CDC is supporting is to try and come up. And we've started off beginning with the 3 key things, gender, jobs, and climate. And coming up, you know, bringing together the best of IPSO and IRIS to try and standardize. But the reality is, you know, it is very hard to do. I mean, within CDC, we do it on the portfolio level. How many jobs do we have? On a sector level, you know, relevant to, you know, power, what percentage is green, how many lives. And then at every investment, we hold ourselves to account. We've used the impact management framework rather than creating our own to try and get people to consolidate. Does that, you know, that's, yeah.
Emilie, did you want to comment anything? Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll go just before you because I know this is an area that you have. I can just speak towards the kind of the practical kind of what we do in ISIF. So it's one of our core activities. And we have mainly been relying on the 5 dimensions of impact by IMP, which looks at the what, the why, the how, and how much. I'm missing one of them, but roughly those are the categories. And but I completely, the sense that we've gotten is that there are many different frameworks and methodologies out there. And even within a very small organization such as ours, trying to standardize across different business models, different sectors, different, right, very different industries. It's difficult to compare the impact that we're having. So yeah, leave it to Jasjit.
So I agree with all of that. And just to add a couple of points, I mean, for sure, we need to move more towards standardization. And I would combine that with not just standardization, but third-party measurement. And I think we're moving in that direction. But without that, you know, everybody can say we measured it. And it's great. And this is where I think the role of regulator is also very important, which is increasingly happening, especially in Europe. One of the things I would say, the danger, so I see conversations about there was the financial accounting, and of course, you know, there were a lot of assumptions involved even there, but look, we came up with the standards, so why can't we come up with that in impact? I think we are closer to that on the environmental than the social metrics, but the social one has some pretty strong ethical elements built in. And so my concern, to be honest, is if the people in power come up with the frameworks for simplifying social metrics, it is their subjective views that will get embedded in those frameworks without people realizing it. And just to give an example, going back to IMM, right? So on the one hand, yes, the holy grail is, can you come up with a dollar value for impact? But you cannot do a framework like IMM, and you know, credit to the authors of the HBR article and TPG Rise and Bridgespan and all of that. That came up with. They are transparent about the assumptions, but this is why it's important to actually read the full article and not the headlines. Among other things, one of the assumptions built in is, what is each human life worth? And the subtitle of that is the life of an Indian worth the same as the life of an American? Now, practically the way the world works, the life of an American is worth, my estimate is about 100 times the life of an Indian. That's how the world works. If you practically see how much people get compensated, let's say by Bhopal tragedy in India versus somebody getting, how much money do they get if there's an accident in the US? The life of American in a typical estimate is between $5 million and $10 million, according to. Now, as the financial institution, do you get to decide that? Do we let these spreadsheets where these assumptions are there, do we force them to have all human life the same? Do we adjust it for GDP of countries? I mean, this might sound ridiculous, but once you get into details, this really is the core of the matter. Similarly, we talk about jobs created. Well, jobs created, there's two questions, right? Which is, who are you creating the jobs for? Are you creating jobs for people who would not have jobs at all, or they will be living in extreme poverty and now they have respectable living? Or are you creating jobs for people, white collar people who already had reasonable jobs, and yeah, maybe they got a 3% increment because you created a job? So and who gets to decide how you sort of add it up to one number? So these are things, and that's why I think in the impact space, it's very important. We need smart people, like the kind of people that are in this call, not just sort of on the fringes, but in the mainstream in conversations as investors, as corporates, or when people are talking about ESG and impact, to really play an active role to understand what's happening. Is it fair? Is it right? Rather than looking for quick answers on this is how we'll come up with that one number.
Excellent. Well, I think we are at the end of our hour and want to be respectful of the time of everyone. So I thought it was a really great session, right on topic for INSEAD and business as a force for good. So thank you so much to all of you, the participants who joined. Sorry we couldn't have all the answers, to all the questions you asked, but if some of them are really pressing, feel free to send it to us, the organizers, and we'll try to answer with the help of our speakers. So I want to thank you very much, Graham, Jasjit, Emilie, very much for your time today and your insights. My co-moderator again, the other organizers, Carl Bain Stephenson, Zhenghai Chai from the INDEVOR MBA, Katie Smith-Milway from the INDEVOR Alumni. The Hoffman Institute was also helpful to us, and as well as the Community Impact Challenge. So it's been a teamwork of the impact community at INSEAD, and really want to thank everybody and invite you for our next event, which we will advertise soon. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.